So they found a kangaroo, which isn't native to the places where you find a lot of the other things. So, they have animals from all over the place and they have a kangaroo here. So this is almost like they're trapped in a zoo because, you just don't find these things wandering around. Or you find kangaroos wandering around in Australia, but you don't find ortolans wandering around Australia. That's more of a European bird, and the bustard isn't. There's some stuff that's only found in South America, and so you have all of these animals from all over the place, and they're just the only thing they have in common is you don't find them in Switzerland. So yeah, that's kind of a problem, but it's still a fun book, and it's still interesting to see them stumble upon these things. Now, they talked about a kangaroo, and they checked its teeth. And Linnaeus came up with this system of categorizing animals based on what they look like. And one of the ways that mammals were classified is by their teeth. And rodents have two incisors that continuously grow. And they get longer and longer and longer, and they have to gnaw them down. So if you have a pet mouse, a pet guinea pig, a pet hamster, you have to give them cardboard or something or a piece of wood that they can chew on to wear their teeth down, because eventually their teeth will grow too long and they can actually injure themselves. They can't close their jaws. It grows up through their bad things happen. So you give them cardboard and wood to chew on and chew down their teeth. So they looked at the teeth and it's like, oh, it's a rodent. And they said, like, oh, like a Jerboa. Jerboa is a little guy. He's a little guy, smaller than a rabbit. And it kind of hops. It's, as I said, it's a rodent, so it's related to the mouse and such. And it kind of hops. And it has a long tail and a little tuft at the end. It's a very cute critter. So they're like, oh, it's like a Jerboa. And it's like, kangaroo. And kangaroos are not at all related to rodents. Because, they originally started out by saying, okay, this looks like that and this looks like that, so they must be related. The thing is that animals evolve and change over time. And sometimes you have a pattern which is really, really good. And it's like, the two front teeth for gnawing is really, really good. It's really efficient. It's, you have the left and the right. And so if one of them gets lost or broken, you still have the other side. And so it's efficient. You don't need a lot of teeth. They're continuously growing. And so that's a really good pattern. So what happens is that if a pattern is really good, it gets reused because it's the most efficient way to do this. And so all throughout nature, you have all of these things that end up looking alike, but just aren't. Like, for instance, crabs. There's this thing that they found where arthropods in the water will tend to take on a crab shape when certain things happen. When there's low tide, when there's little tidal motion, when there's semi-shallow water. And it's like this set of features that just start spontaneously developing because it's these legs get arranged at the side of the body because it's more efficient to move in these circumstances. And it like happens, which is weird. But it's one of those things, it's like, no, this is a pattern that works. And it's something called Convergent Evolution, where you end up with things that look like cactuses, even though they aren't cactuses, because they live in dry areas. And so the leaves get shorter and shorter and shorter because the leaves are where the plant loses the water from. So in a dry area, the leaves get shorter and shorter and shorter, and eventually become needles. And the body of the cactus or the body of the plant starts getting bigger and starts losing a dark bark in order to get more photosynthesis on that. So you have this tendency to just grow into a cactus shape because the leaves start disappearing, the body starts photosynthesizing, and you end up with the cactus. And it just sort of happens. So they looked at the kangaroo, and the kangaroo is like, oh, yeah, it's a rodent. Well, it's not a rodent. It's a marsupial. And marsupials are animals with pouches. Or mammals with pouches. And as they said, yeah, they keep their young. And when a baby kangaroo is born, it is like really teeny tiny. And it lives in the mother's pouch. So it's born this little teeny tiny thing that can't move, can't do anything. And it lives in its mother's pouch, and the mother's pouch has the nipple in it. So the baby feeds, and that's all it does. It lives in the pouch, and it feeds, and it grows, and it lives, and it feeds, and it grows, and it grows, and it grows, and it grows, and it grows. And eventually it starts getting out of the pouch. Once, after a few months of living in the pouch and growing, it's big enough to go out on its own. And it still occasionally hops back in, but that's a marsupial. And then those, that branched off from the rest of the mammals a long time ago, because Australia split off from the other continents a long time before the other ones did. So that's why everything in Australia is weird. Australia has the only monotremes, which are mammals that lay eggs. So there are mammals out there that lay eggs. There's two of them, the platypus and the echidna. They lay eggs. Anyway, they lay eggs, and everyone just thought, when the explorers came back from Australia with the platypus, it's like, no, that's not real. Everyone's like, that's fake. You glued that together. And yeah, people were gluing animal bits together, but took a look at the platypus. It's like, no, that's glued. There's no way that's real. And it's like, oh yeah, and it lays eggs. And everyone's like, no, I don't believe it. People wouldn't believe it. It was just too wild. So they have Swiss Family Robinson. They found kangaroo. Now, there's one thing that they mentioned a few times in this chapter that needs explaining. They talked about preserving the food in butter or lard. And this was something that they did before they had refrigeration. And in order to keep food from spoiling, you have to keep bad bacteria from growing. And in order to keep bad bacteria from growing, you first have to kill all of the bad bacteria on the thing. And then you have to find some way to seal it and keep it out. So nowadays, they can. Or, back in the 40s, 50s, turn of the century, they canned. Canning takes equipment, and they obviously don't have this. Or nowadays we can seal stuff in plastic. So you can take the steak and you can seal it in plastic. And if you blast it with radiation, it'll kill all the bacteria inside. And because it's sealed in plastic, nothing can get in. And in theory, it can keep, if it's been blasted, if it's been thoroughly blasted with the radiation or pasteurized or whatever, it can keep. So an egg, you get it washed. There are ways of sealing the outside of an egg, and the egg will just keep. Now, back in the day, before they had plastic, before they had good sealing technologies, what they could do is they could take the food and put it hot. So it starts out, it's hot. So it's hot enough to kill anything growing in it. And they put it in butter. And what happened was the butter melted around it, sealed it up airtight. So you have the food sealed in butter, airtight, and it would just keep. And you could do this with lard as well, because lard is also long fatty acids. And these long fatty acids block out the air, and they harden around it, and they keep the bacteria out. They keep the bugs out. And so you have essentially this food sealed in butter. And so when you want to eat it, all you have to do is break open the butter and take out the food. And then you can reuse the butter. The butter will start picking up stuff from the meat and whatever. But anyway, this was a thing that was done back in the day. And you would even have the soups. They'd cook the soup, and the soup would have the fat layer up on top. And when it chilled, you have the fat layer sealing everything. and hopefully it was hot enough to kill off all the bad things inside of it. But this wasn't perfect, and if you did it wrong, you ended up with botulism. And botulism is, well, it kills you. It kills people. But, modern science, we've pretty much gotten rid of botulism because we know how to boil it hot enough to kill botulism and how to, allow it to, make the food safe. But this was one of the ways that they did to keep the food safer for a long time, to preserve the food for a long time. It's kind of fallen out of use because, as I said, it's not perfect, and you can end up with botulism, and as I said, botulism can kill you. Botulism, I may have mentioned before, is one of the pretty ways to die. If you've heard of Botox treatments, where people needles, and the doctors use needles, and they inject this stuff called Botox, which is short for botulinum toxin. They inject this essentially poison into people's foreheads, but do it in little doses. And what the botulism toxin does is it paralyzes the muscles, which is how botulism kills people, because it paralyzes the muscles that you need to breathe. And so if you can't breathe, you die. So what would happen is people would eat canned food that had been canned improperly or had been preserved improperly, and as a result would get botulism, and they would be paralyzed. They'd be unable to move. And modern days, if they catch the botulism early and they like, oh, this person won't be able to move until their body processes the poison in 10 to 12 days, put them on a ventilator, they'll be fine. But, you have to catch it right away. And doesn't happen. But then again, we have technology and we know all about botulism. And it's like, oh, gee, this food is canned, and gee, the can is swelling. That's not good. So, don't eat food that's swollen cans, because that's a sign that things are not right with it. So anyway, death cabbage. Yes, your lolly said death cabbage. I'm recording this just after New Year's, and when your lolly cooked a New Year's dinner with sauerkraut and pork, she grabbed a bag of sauerkraut, because sauerkraut comes in jars and cans, and I can tell you about making sauerkraut. I don't know if they make sauerkraut in this book. They might. They might make sauerkraut. If they do make sauerkraut, I'll tell you about it. But otherwise, I've told you about sauerkraut, actually. So anyway, sauerkraut. Anyway, she had a bag of sauerkraut, and the bag got puffy. Maybe it was just air sealed in it. But your lolly and your dad and... No?
Yeah, maybe Paul.
Yeah, your lolly and your dad got food poisoning. They didn't get paralyzed or anything like that, but it was enough to make them ill. So that's like the first stage of food poisoning, is you get ill and your body gets rid of the bad food any way it can. So, that's food poisoning. Food poisoning is not fun. And anyway, they had the food poisoning and they got better. But your lolly does not trust bagged sauerkraut at all. Has to be a can, has to be in a jar. Jar is probably the safest, because if the pressure starts building in a jar, it just explodes. And so, if the jar just explodes, it's like, well, I'm not going to eat that because it exploded. The can can puff out, but cans are pretty rigid things, and so it takes a lot for it to puff out, and so it won't necessarily puff out quickly, and you may be in trouble. But the soaked in butter is... The caked in butter is not used much anymore. There is one instance where I know it is used modern times, and that is for aging steaks. And there's different ways of aging steaks. There's wet aging and dry aging. And the best steaks are not eaten immediately afterwards, because there's a whole bunch of chemical things that happen with the meat. It breaks down and it changes over time. Things that aren't rotting. They're enzymes that are naturally active in the muscles that break things down, and it changes the flavor and it changes the texture, and aged steaks are like a total thing. And there's different ways of aging them, and dry aging is you take it and you keep it in the refrigerator for 30 days or 60 days. There are people who are like connoisseurs. It's like, oh yes, the steak is so much better after 90 days. It takes on a blue cheese flavor. It's like, I'm not sure I want to eat a steak that tastes like blue cheese, but maybe. Anyway, so there was somebody who came up with the idea of, hey, I'll just take the steak and I'll seal it in butter and put it in the fridge. And that kept it from drying out. So it kept it still moist, but it still got the advantages of aging. So that's one thing that I've seen it used. I've never tasted a butter-aged steak. I just know it's a thing. So it's something that's out there and exists. And they say it's good, but at the same time, you know, people eat all sorts of weird things and say it's wonderful. It's like, here, taste this truffle. It's like, great. It tastes like dirt. Well, no, truffles don't taste like dirt, but truffles are a fungus, and they kind of taste like a fungus. And yeah, not a fan of truffles, not a fan of mushrooms, but you know, it's like, yes, I understand that there is that taste, and I understand that this is something that is rare and hard to come by, so therefore it's expensive. But just because it's expensive doesn't necessarily make it good. Just because it's expensive doesn't make it good. And they talked about conserving their ammo and planting gunpowder. Now, gunpowder comes from the ground, and eventually they're going to have to find a way to make more, because this is one of those things that they just can't make. As I said before, when he bent the gun, it's like, you can't make a gun without a lot of equipment. And making gunpowder is not difficult. The ratios aren't difficult. I can't remember what they are offhand. I mean, this is one of those things that you can look up, and it's... I once knew it by heart. I once knew, oh yeah, it's 1 part charcoal, or it's 5 parts charcoal, 1 part sulfur, 20 parts saltpeter. Something like that. I remember the number 20 in there, but it's, you know, it's like this ratio that it's like, if you know it, you know it. And so this is something easy enough to make if you can find this stuff. Now, charcoal you can make. Charcoal, they have plants, they can make charcoal. Sulfur is difficult to find. Saltpeter is difficult to find. You can make saltpeter from manure, guano. So that's why there were huge fights in the South Pacific over islands, because these islands had nothing on them but birds, and the birds did nothing but make guano for hundreds of years. So there were these islands that were just like 10 feet deep in bird stuff. And after World War I, you know, people went nuts in the South Pacific and started seizing these islands. And the U.S. even passed a law that any island with bird droppings on it was American property. So yeah, they just seized all of these islands, and they stripped off the fertilizer, and yeah. But to make gunpowder. One of those weird things that happened back in the early 1900s that everyone's like, that really happened? It's like, yeah. Anyway, that's that.